My mother-in-law planned a baby shower, but it was actually my farewell party to Italy. When I saw the happy trip banner instead of baby decorations, my world crumbled. Through tears of confusion, anger, and fear, I discovered that my husband had received an irresistible offer in Tuscany. A family conspiracy changed everything. A story about overcoming fears, rediscovering roots, and finding courage when we least expect it. Get ready to be moved. Leave your like and comment on where you're watching from. My mother-in-law threw me a baby shower, but it was actually my going-away party. I never liked surprises. Maybe it's the result of a childhood where every "I have a surprise for you" meant another city change, another new school, another set of faces to memorize and then forget. Ironically, I spent my whole life preparing to avoid shocks, and yet, at 35, I found myself at the center of a family conspiracy that would completely change the course of my orderly existence. I remember it like it was yesterday. That spring afternoon in Curitiba was particularly beautiful, with a blue sky that seemed to mock my anxiety. As I ran my hands over my 4-month belly, I thought about how finally, after so many tests, hidden tears, and desperate prayers, I had managed to get pregnant. A small victory for the world, a gigantic one for me. Teresa, my mother-in-law, insisted on organizing the baby shower. "Leave it to me, dear. You already have too much to worry about," she said with that Italian accent that, even after 50 years in Brazil, remained as strong as her lavender perfume. How could I refuse something to the matriarch who kept the whole family together with a firm hand and watchful eyes? Besides, she was the only maternal figure I had left after Mom passed away 5 years ago, taking with her cornmeal cake recipes that I never learned to make quite right. I arrived at the party hall in Santa Felicidade, punctually at 3 in the afternoon, as agreed. Curitiba's Italian neighborhood always seemed like a small piece of another world to me, with its traditional cantinas, well-kept gardens, and elderly ladies chatting on the porches. The taxi stopped in front of an old mansion, converted into an event space, and I remember thinking it was strange not to see cars from other guests. I must be the first one, I thought, adjusting the floral dress I had bought especially for the occasion. When I opened the heavy wooden door, I was greeted not by the silence of an empty hall, but by an explosion of familiar voices shouting, "Surprise!" in unison. I blinked several times, trying to process the scene in front of me. Tables laden with antipastos, pasta, and typical sweets. Pastel-toned decorations. Yes, but no teddy bears or diapers. Instead, a huge banner hung on the main wall. "Happy trip to Italy." My first thought was that they had mixed up the parties. Maybe this was the wrong hall, someone else's celebration. But soon I saw my husband, Antonio, walking towards me with a nervous smile that I knew all too well. Beside him, Teresa was holding not a diaper cake, but a photo album of Tuscany. And in the center of the main table, where the baby gifts should have been, there were suitcases. Suitcases with my name on them. "What is this?" I asked, my voice thinner than usual. Antonio took my trembling hands in his and began to explain something about a unique opportunity. 3 months in Italy, traditional Tuscan cuisine. The words reached my ears as if from far away, distorted by disbelief. "But what about the baby shower?" I stammered, looking down at my belly as if I needed to remind everyone that there was a child on the way. "This is much better than a baby shower, Mariana," Teresa exclaimed, coming to hug me with that Mediterranean effusiveness that always made me uncomfortable. "You're going to see the land of your ancestors. Our little grandson will be born knowing his roots." "Born? I'm not going to give birth in Italy," I protested, feeling the panic rising. "And my job? School? We're in the middle of the school year." The collective laughter that followed only increased my confusion. It was my sister-in-law, Luciana, who explained that everything, absolutely everything, was already settled. My leave from the school where I taught history had been approved. The doctor, my own obstetrician, part of the conspiracy, had confirmed that traveling until the 6th month was safe. The passports were ready. The tickets bought. "You planned all this behind my back?" I asked, my voice choked with emotion. I couldn't tell at that moment whether it was gratitude or fury I felt. If we had told you, you would never have agreed, Antonio replied with that frankness that sometimes irritated me deeply. You always say no before even considering the possibilities. That sentence hurt more than anything else. It was a mirror being held up to me, reflecting a truth I didn't want to see. My whole life had been built on predictability, security, control. The daughter of parents who moved city every time there was a promotion or financial difficulty, I swore to myself that I would put down roots, establish routines, never venture into the unknown. And it worked for 15 years. My career as a history teacher was stable, my marriage solid, our life organized around small certainties and big avoidances. Come, try this, said Luciana, saving me from the moment of introspection by placing a sweet that looked like a small crispy tube in my hand. It's Sicilian cannoli, Nonna's recipe. I bit into the sweet without enthusiasm, more out of politeness than anything else. And then, something strange happened. The contrast between the crispy shell and the creamy ricotta filling with pistachio awakened a memory in me that I didn't even know I possessed. My father, who had passed away so long ago, sitting on the edge of my bed, telling stories about his Italian grandparents, who had arrived in Brazil with little more than dreams and family recipes. I remembered him saying, "One day we'll see their land, Mariana. One day." That day never came for him, and I, in my stubborn pursuit of stability, had never considered fulfilling that dream. I swallowed the sweet along with a lump in my throat. Throughout the party, I smiled mechanically, accepted hugs, thanked people for their enthusiastic words, people who were apparently happier about my trip than I was myself. But inside, I was boiling. How could they decide about my life like this? About my baby? Back at the apartment, after the last guest had left, I finally let my mask fall. How could you do this to me? I shouted at Antonio, violently unbuttoning the tight buttons of the dress that was now suffocating me. Decide something like this without consulting me? I was going to turn down the offer. He replied with a calmness that only worsened my state. I knew you wouldn't accept the change. Like always. Like always? What does that mean? It means I'm tired of seeing you sabotaging opportunities before even considering them. When we first met, you were curious. You talked about seeing the world. Now, you get anxious if we need to have dinner at a new restaurant. His words hit deep, opening a wound I didn't even know I carried. It was true. When did I turn into this fearful person, clinging to security like a lifeline? When did I stop dreaming? So you and your mother decided to manipulate me. Great solution, I retorted, tears now flowing freely. It was Mama's idea, yes, but I agreed because he stopped, running his hands through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, I could awaken something in you again. Something beyond this perfect teacher, this predictable wife, something of the Mariana I met. We slept in separate rooms that night. Me in our bed, him on the couch. Between us, an abyss much larger than the few meters of hallway. During the sleepless night, I got up and went to the living room bookshelf. I picked up a book on Italian history that I used to prepare lessons on immigration. The pages were marked, annotated, but never truly felt. I leafed through it distractedly until I came across a photograph of Tuscany, ancient olive trees under a sky golden with sunset, and something clicked inside me. What if they were right? What if this was the opportunity not to abandon my security, but to expand its borders? When the sun rose, I had already made my decision. It was the first time in years that I had acted on impulse, without meticulously weighing pros and cons. And curiously, I felt immense relief. We're going to Italy, I announced during breakfast, watching Antonio's expression shift from surprise to caution, like someone fearing a trap. Are you sure? Because we can cancel everything, I'll explain to Mama. No, we're not canceling. I took a deep breath, but we're going my way. I want to understand everything. Where we're going to stay, what the job will be like, which doctors will see me there. And I want you to know that I'm terrified, but I'm willing to try. The news that I had accepted the trip spread through the neighborhood with the speed that only positive gossip can achieve. Sana Felicidade, with its strong Italian heritage, transformed my journey into a community event. Suddenly, I, who had always lived discreetly, was stopped on the street by enthusiastic elderly people. Donna Carmela, the 80-year-old lady who sold vegetables at the market, grabbed my hands with surprising strength. "You're going to see my Sicily. Bring me a handful of soil," she asked with teary eyes. I didn't have the heart to explain that we were going to Tuscany, not Sicily. Geography seemed irrelevant in the face of that genuine emotion. Signor Giuseppe, the owner of the cantina where we had Sunday dinners, showed up at our door with a bottle of homemade wine and a yellowed envelope. A letter from my cousin in Lucca. 50 years without seeing each other. Tell him I still play the accordion. The letter weighed in my hands like a will, a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but that now moved me. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster. At the school where I taught, I encountered obstacles I hadn't expected. The principal, Solange, always so professional, revealed a petty side by creating difficulties for my leave. "I don't see how your trip has any academic relevance, Mariana," she said, adjusting her glasses with a superior air. "Your research on Italian immigration could be perfectly conducted right here, in the university library." I swallowed the acidic reply I wanted to give. In the past, I would have accepted her refusal, retreated to my comfort zone, but something had changed in me. "With all due respect, Solange, the leave has already been approved by the Department of Education," I replied with a calmness I didn't feel. "And as for academic relevance, I intend to document stories of immigrants who came to Paraná directly from the regions I will be visiting. First-hand material that will enrich our local history classes." The silence that followed was my first, small victory. Parallel to the practical preparations, I started intensive Italian classes at the Italian Forum of Curitiba. The cultural space, a neoclassical building in the city center, became my second home. 3 times a week, I sat among elderly ladies who spoke fluently in the language of their ancestors, feeling completely inadequate. Non preoccupati, cara. Professor Bianca would console me when I almost cried out of frustration at not being able to pronounce correctly. "Your baby will learn faster than you." It was a recurring joke in the group, which I tried to receive with a smile, although inside I was gnawing at myself. The truth is, I've always had difficulty with languages. As a historian, my strength was analyzing documents, not producing them in other languages. Each class was an exercise in humility and perseverance. At home, Antonio practiced with me, patiently repeating basic phrases while preparing dinner. The kitchen, his natural domain as a chef, transformed into our improvised classroom. The aroma of pomodoro sauce and fresh basil became the soundtrack to my clumsy attempts at communication. "How do you do it?" I asked one night, exhausted after an hour of trying to master the Italian subjunctive. "How can you be so calm with all this change?" He paused what he was doing, wiped his hands on his apron, and held my face between his rough hands, the hands of someone who works with fire and knives. "I'm scared too, Mari, but I learned in the kitchen that the best dishes come when we risk a new ingredient, when we leave the fire on for an extra minute, when we trust our intuition." It was a simple metaphor, but deeply true. Antonio had always been like that. Practical, intuitive, open to improvisation. The opposite of my need for control, for exact recipes, and predictable results. 2 weeks before departure, everything fell apart. During a routine checkup, my obstetrician frowned at the ultrasound monitor. "Your blood pressure is a little high, Mariana, and there are some signs that worry me." The words came out clinical, professional, but the subtext was clear. "I recommend absolute rest for at least 10 days, then we'll reevaluate the trip." Absolute rest. 10 days. The trip was scheduled for 14 days from then. I returned home devastated, imagining how I would break the news to Antonio, to Teresa, to everyone who had been involved in the preparations. But even before I could open my mouth, one look at my face was enough. "What happened?" asked Antonio, dropping the cell phone where he was probably discussing work details in Tuscany. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady, but in the end, the tears came. They weren't just tears of worry about the pregnancy, although that was the priority. They were tears of frustration at seeing fate once again confirm that I shouldn't leave my comfort zone, that adventures weren't for me. "It's a sign," I murmured between sobs. "We should never have planned this." Antonio hugged me in silence. He didn't argue, didn't try to rationalize. He just held me while I broke down. The days of forced rest were surprisingly revealing. Confined to the apartment with strict orders, not to stress, an irony considering the circumstances, I received regular visits that changed my perspective. The first surprise was Teresa. My mother-in-law, always practical and busy, began to appear daily with homemade soups and stories she had never shared. Sitting in the armchair next to the sofa where I spent my days, she would unravel narratives of her youth in post-war Italy. Not the picturesque stories of parties and traditions she usually told at family gatherings, but honest, sometimes painful accounts. "I wanted to be a teacher, you know?" she revealed one afternoon, while serving me vegetable broth. "I studied until I was 16. I had excellent grades. But Dad got sick. We needed money. So I went to work in the garment factory, sewing for the ladies. When I met Vincenzo, your father-in-law, I thought I would have another chance. But then the children came. The immigration to Brazil. There was always something more urgent than my studies. I looked at that woman who had always intimidated me with her efficiency and determination, and I saw something new, a distorted reflection of myself, of my own renunciations disguised as sensible choices. "Did you ever regret it?" I asked, softly. She shrugged, a gesture strangely youthful for her 70 years. "Regret is a luxury, my dear, but I think a lot about what could have been. That's why I insisted so much on this trip for you. Some trains only pass once in a lifetime." Our conversations continued in the following days, creating an intimacy I never thought possible. Teresa, who had always seemed controlling and intrusive, revealed herself to be a complex woman, shaped by difficult choices and postponed dreams. And in her stories, I began to recognize patterns that were repeated in my own life. Another unexpected visit was from my high school senior students. 6 teenagers showed up with a cake they had made, horribly crooked but incredibly touching, and a gift, a handmade travel journal. "For you to write everything down," explained Mateus, the student who had resisted my history classes the most at the beginning of the year. "Because we want a book when you come back. A real book, not those boring textbooks the school uses." I held the journal covered with clippings of old maps and felt a new responsibility being born. It wasn't just my personal journey. It was an opportunity to bring something meaningful to those young people, to show them that history isn't just what's in books, but what we live and document. On the 10th day of rest, I returned to the doctor's office. Dr. Paulo examined the new tests with a neutral expression that tormented my already fragile nerves. "So?" I asked, unable to wait another second. He smiled, finally. "It was a false alarm, Mariana. Your blood pressure is normal. The indicators have stabilized. I still recommend care, obviously, but I see no reason to prevent the trip." The wave of relief that washed over me was so intense that I had to hold on to the table to avoid falling. I thanked him profusely, promised to follow all recommendations, already imagining how I would break the news to Antonio. But upon leaving the office, I saw a call from my mother on my cell phone. My mother, Maria do Carmo's, health had been a constant concern for years. Widowed since my father died in a car accident when I was 12, she had developed a series of chronic conditions that she managed with a mix of medication, stubbornness, and denial. Living alone in a small downtown apartment, she refused to consider safer alternatives, insisting on her independence. The call was from the hospital. Mom had fallen at home, nothing serious, but the tests revealed a cardiac arrhythmia that would require regular monitoring. The doctor was clear. She would need supervision in the coming months, weekly appointments, medication adjustments. And so, when one door opened, another seemed to close. How could I leave the country knowing that my mother needed me? It was the final confirmation that some people were simply not born for adventures. Our place is in the rear guard, taking care of the bases so that others can fly. I returned home with a heavy heart. Antonio was in the kitchen, experimenting with modifications to a traditional risotto recipe that he intended to present in Italy. The aroma of saffron and white wine filled the apartment. "The doctor gave the okay," I announced, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. I told him about the tests, the normalized blood pressure, the good indicators. I left the part about my mother for later, like a poison one avoids tasting for as long as possible. Antonio hugged me and twirled me around the kitchen, his happiness so genuine that it amplified my guilt. When I finally told him about Mom's situation, he didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of it. "We'll hire someone to help her," he suggested, as if it were that simple. "Or we'll ask Luciana to check on her regularly." "You don't understand," I replied, the weariness of days of tension emerging in my voice. "It's not just a matter of basic supervision. It's medical appointments, medication adjustments, decisions that need to be made. She only trusts me for that." "Will you always be the only solution to your mother's problems?" His question was soft, but it hit like a slap. "When will it be your turn to prioritize your own dreams?" I wanted to shout that they weren't my dreams, that this whole trip was his dream, imposed on me. But the truth is, after weeks of preparations, Italian classes, conversations with Teresa and my students, something had changed. The trip was no longer just Antonio's idea. It had become, in some tortuous way, mine too. The solution came in the most unexpected way possible in my mother's cramped kitchen, where I went the next day to discuss the necessary arrangements. The familiar aroma of cornmeal cake baking brought tears to my eyes, even before I could explain the situation. "So you're going to cancel the trip because of me?" Mom concluded after I finished my carefully crafted explanation. It wasn't a question, but a statement loaded with a familiar weight, the weight of guilt that had always existed between us. "It's not canceling, it's postponing," I corrected, although I knew that the opportunity would probably not repeat itself. "Antonio can go ahead, start the job, and maybe I can join him later, when I'm better, when I don't need you anymore." She laughed, a short, harsh sound. "That day will never come, my dear. You know that." Her brutal frankness caught me off guard. Mom had always been direct, but she rarely admitted her emotional dependence. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you stay now, you'll stay forever. For me, for the baby, for any convenient excuse." She got up with difficulty, went to a drawer in the dresser, and took out a yellowed envelope. "Do you know what this is?" "A ticket to Paris that your father bought for us on our 10th wedding anniversary. It was supposed to be a surprise. He died 2 weeks before the trip." I took the envelope with trembling hands. I had never seen it, never known about that plan interrupted by tragedy. "I kept this as a reminder of what could have been," she continued. "And I promised myself that you would live differently. But look at you, just like me, postponing life, choosing the safe, the predictable." Her words were precise needles, hitting exactly where it hurt the most. "So what do you suggest? That I simply abandon you when you need me?" She smiled, a smile that lit up her tired face in a way I hadn't seen in years. "I suggest I go with you." It was my turn to laugh incredulously. "To Italy? With your condition? The doctors would never approve of that." "Why not? I have arrhythmia. I'm not dying. My doctors can recommend a colleague over there. I have international health insurance that I've never used. And mainly," she paused dramatically, "I have a pregnant daughter who needs someone who knows how to knit baby clothes in the Italian style." The idea was absurd, irresponsible, potentially problematic. And yet, when I contemplated it, a sense of possibility opened up in my chest. Wouldn't it be simpler, in fact, to take Mom with us? To have someone trustworthy nearby during the pregnancy? Someone who could help with the baby later? What would Antonio say? I murmured, more to myself than to her. "That boy adores me, and you know it," she replied with a confidence that admitted no argument. "Besides, I promise not to interfere in his kitchen." When I presented the proposal to Antonio that night, I expected resistance, practical questions, maybe even a polite refusal. Instead, he seemed genuinely enthusiastic. "Your mother is an incredible woman," he said, already thinking about the necessary arrangements. "And she's right. It will be good to have someone trustworthy around when the baby is born." "When the baby is born?" I thought we would be back before that." He looked at me with that expression that meant, "Haven't you realized yet?" And my heart raced. "Mari, if everything goes well in these initial 3 months, the restaurant wants to offer me a permanent position. We're talking about an opportunity that could change our lives." And so, the small temporary adventure transformed into the possibility of a permanent change. The family panic began to grow, but along with it, something new. A curiosity about what it would be like to raise our child in another country, living between 2 cultures, 2 languages, 2 worlds. When everything seemed finally settled, Mom's tickets bought, medical arrangements made, luggage almost ready, came the coup de grace. A strike by European airlines announced 2 days before our departure. Flights canceled indefinitely. The restaurant in Tuscany pressing for a decision, threatening to rehire someone else if Antonio didn't arrive on the agreed date. The suggestion that he leave alone somehow, with alternative airlines, while Mom and I waited for the strike to end, came as an ultimatum. "Go," I said, feeling noble and miserable at the same time. "This is your chance. Mom and I will follow as soon as possible." We were on the balcony of the apartment, the Curitiba night sky dotted with stars that seemed too distant to matter. Antonio shook his head, frustration evident on his face. "This isn't how I imagined it," he replied, his voice low. "It was supposed to be an adventure, together." Something in the way he said that, the pure, almost childlike disappointment, touched me deeply. It wasn't about Italian cuisine or career opportunities. It was about breaking together the invisible chains that kept us tied to limited versions of ourselves. "We'll find a solution," I promised, holding his hand. And for the first time, it wasn't just an empty, comforting phrase. It was a real promise. The next night, I organized a dinner at Signor Giuseppe's cantina. It was an impulsive decision, the kind of thing the old Mariana would never do. Gather people without meticulous planning, without a clear agenda. I just called the people who had been part of this crazy journey: Teresa and Vincenzo, Luciana and her husband, my mother, some teacher colleagues, even my senior students. The long wooden tables of the traditional cantina, where whole families, gathered on Sundays, seemed like the perfect setting for what I needed to do. Between plates of polenta and lively conversations, I asked for everyone's attention and announced our decision. Not only were we all going to Italy together, having discovered an alternative route through Portugal, thanks to a former student who worked at a travel agency, but I would use this time to research the history of Italian immigrants in Brazil for a book I had always dreamed of writing. A book? Antonio looked at me surprised, as I had never shared this dream with him. "You never mentioned it." "Because I always thought it wasn't the right time," I confessed, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. I always came up with 1,000 excuses, 1,000 reasons to postpone it. But this trip, this surprise, made me realize how many things I've put off because of fear. The silence that followed had a different weight. It wasn't the awkward silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the respectful silence of someone who recognizes a moment of transformation. It was Teresa who broke it, raising her glass of wine with slightly trembling hands. "To Mariana," she toasted, her eyes shining in a way I had never noticed before. "May she find not only stories for her book in the land of her ancestors, but also parts of herself." Those words, spoken by the woman who had orchestrated this whole upheaval in my life, sounded almost prophetic, and in many ways they were. Our departure took place on a rainy dawn, 3 days later. Afonso Pena Airport was almost deserted. At that hour, our voices echoing in the hall as we said goodbye to friends and family. Luciana gave me an amulet that had belonged to Nona, a small golden cornucopia, a symbol of abundance, to protect the baby. Signor Giuseppe showed up, with 3 more envelopes for different relatives scattered throughout Italy. My students brought a Brazilian flag signed by the whole class. As I boarded, I felt that familiar anxiety tighten my chest, but now it was accompanied by something new: anticipation. As a historian, I had always looked to the past, analyzing events and their consequences with the security of someone who already knows the outcome. Now, I was looking to the future, an unplanned, unstudied, uncontrolled future. And surprisingly, it didn't paralyze me. The flight to Lisbon was smooth, with Mom sleeping most of the time and Antonio feverishly studying a book on Tuscan culinary techniques. I alternated between naps and notes in my new travel journal, already thinking about the structure of the book I intended to write. In Lisbon, we had a whole day to wait for the flight to Florence. We took the opportunity to quickly visit Barro, Alto, where Antonio insisted on trying pastéis de nata, while comparing the culinary influences between Portugal and Italy. Mom was enchanted by the historical tiles, photographing them compulsively with her new cell phone, a gift from me so she could document the adventure, as she put it. It was during that brief walk in Lisbon that I noticed another subtle change. I wasn't just tolerating the unexpected, I was beginning to appreciate it. When we got lost in the narrow streets, instead of the usual panic, I felt a curiosity about where those paths might lead us. When a restaurant we planned to visit was closed, instead of frustration, we discovered a small family tavern where the owner played Fado while we ate. "You're different," Antonio observed while we waited for the flight to Florence, his fingers intertwined with mine. "Lighter. I'm exhausted. My feet are swollen, and I'm afraid of what's to come," I replied honestly. But yes, somehow, I feel lighter. Florence welcomed us with a golden sun and a driver sent by the restaurant where Antonio would work. The journey to the small Tuscan village where we would be staying, an hour from Florence, among hills covered with cypresses and vineyards, was like stepping into a painting I had always admired in art history classes, but never imagined inhabiting. "Olive trees," I whispered to my mother, pointing to the centuries-old trees that lined the winding road. "Some are over 300 years old. Imagine the stories they could tell," she replied, her voice choked, looking at the landscape with the same reverence as I. Our new temporary home was a 19th century stone house, part of a rural property converted into an agriturismo. Thick walls, small windows, a wild garden where aromatic herbs grew freely. The owner, Signor Bianchi, a 70-year-old man with a heavy accent and expansive gestures, explained that the house had belonged to his family for generations. "Many families from here went to Brazil," he commented while showing us the rooms. "My own brother Enzo left for, what's it called? Curitiba? In the 60s. He never came back." I froze upon hearing that name. Enzo Bianchi? The baker on Rua 15? It was his turn to look surprised. "Yes, he opened a bakery. How do you know?" "His bread fed my entire childhood," I replied, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "And now I'm staying in the house that used to be his." That coincidence, which I later discovered wasn't such a coincidence after all, considering the specific patterns of immigration between certain regions of Italy and Brazil, was just the first of many connections we would discover during our stay. The first few days were about settling in. Antonio started his job at the restaurant, spending long hours learning culinary secrets passed down through generations. Mom, surprisingly, adapted with an ease I would never have expected, making friends with the elderly ladies in the village who taught her to knit in the local style. And I, torn between the rest needed for the pregnancy and the eagerness to explore every historical inch of that place, began to collect stories. I started with the obvious, interviewing the oldest residents of the village about relatives who had emigrated to Brazil. Armed with a recorder and my still shaky Italian, I sat in the squares, in the cafes, on the doorsteps, and listened. The stories came easily. Stories of hunger, of hope, of letters that took months to arrive, of money sent to build houses that would wait for returns that never happened. I soon realized that there was a pattern in those narratives. Women rarely made the decision to leave, but they were the ones who maintained the ties between the two worlds. It was their letters, their recipes, their small transplanted rituals that created continuity between the old and the new country. On one of those days of interviews, I met Sophia, a 90-year-old lady who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of the village. Her vivid blue eyes contrasted with her sun-wrinkled skin, and her gnarled hands never stopped moving as she spoke. She told me about her sister, Lucia, who had left for Brazil in 1950. "She was the brave one," said Sophia, serving me strong coffee in delicate cups. I stayed to take care of our parents. It was expected of the eldest daughter. There was resignation in her voice, but also pride in fulfilling her duty. Something in that story resonated deeply with me. The delicate balance between the call of adventure and the anchors of responsibility. Do you regret it? I asked, the same question I had asked Teresa weeks before. Sophia smiled, revealing the absence of several teeth. Regret is a luxury for those who have many choices, my dear. I only had one. I wrote that sentence in my journal, feeling that it touched on something essential about the female experience that crossed generations and continents. I realized that the book I wanted to write was taking shape. It wouldn't just be about migration, but about the women in that process, about choices and non-choices, about the invisible burdens carried across the oceans. In the 5th week of our stay, while researching in the archives of the small local town hall, I made a discovery that changed everything. Among yellowed records of births and deaths from the early 20th century, I found a familiar name, Benedetta Ricci, my maternal grandmother. Impossible, I murmured to myself, checking the dates and parents' names again. There was no doubt. My grandmother, whom I had only known as Benta, the silent lady who spoke Portuguese with a strong accent and had died when I was only 8 years old, had been born in that same village where I was now. I ran home, as fast as my increasingly prominent belly would allow, and confronted my mother with the discovery. Did you know about this? I asked, breathless, handing her the copy of the record I had made. Mom took the paper with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the old characters. No, not exactly. I knew Grandma was Italian, of course, but I never knew the exact town. She didn't like to talk about the past. Why didn't we ever research this before? Why didn't we ever come looking for our roots? She sighed, folding the paper carefully. Because some roots are painful to unearth. My dear, Grandma didn't come to Brazil by choice, but fleeing a forced engagement, a family that rejected her when she refused to marry the man they had chosen. That revelation opened a new dimension in my research. I wasn't just following abstract historical trails. I was reconstructing my own family history, uncovering secrets that had been buried for generations. In the following days, with Signor Bianchi's help, I managed to locate the house that had belonged to my grandmother's family. It was still there, partially in ruins, on top of a hill covered with olive trees. When I finally visited the place, accompanied by Antonio and my mother, I felt a visceral connection to those old stones, as if an invisible thread linked my unborn child to that soil. She must have looked at this same valley, said Mom, emotional, while we contemplated the landscape that opened up before us, before deciding to leave forever, so that we could be here today, completed Antonio, his arm protectively around my shoulders. At that moment, I felt part of something bigger than myself, a long chain of decisions, sacrifices, and new beginnings that had brought me there. And something solidified within me, the certainty that my book needed to be written, not just as a historical record, but as a personal testament. It was around the same time that I received an unexpected email. A professor from the University of Florence, a specialist in migration studies, had heard about my research through one of the residents I interviewed. She invited me to present my work at a small seminar on Italian diasporas. I can't, was my instinctive response. My Italian isn't good enough. My research is still incomplete. I'm 6 months pregnant. That's exactly why you should go, Antonio countered. Think about how many immigrant women made much more difficult journeys carrying children in their wombs, including your grandmother, probably. That argument was impossible to refute. I accepted the invitation, spending the next 2 weeks in a frenzy of preparation, alternating between panic attacks and moments of crystal clear clarity. The presentation took place in a small room at the university for an audience of perhaps 20 people, professors, graduate students, and some curious members of the community. I spoke about immigrant women, their letters, their recipes, their survival strategies in a foreign land. I spoke about my grandmother, her courageous escape from an imposed destiny, and I spoke about myself, a woman who needed to travel to the past to find courage for the future. My Italian was far from perfect, but the genuine emotion compensated for the wrong verb conjugations. When I finished, the applause was warm, sincere. And then, something even more surprising happened. The professor who had invited me offered me a research grant to extend my work for another 9 months. "We have funding for projects that document stories of return," she explained. "Your perspective, as a descendant returning to her roots, is exactly what we are looking for." 9 months. It meant I would give birth in Italy. It meant we would stay away from Brazil for more than a year. It meant a complete transformation of what was supposed to be just a brief adventure. I looked at Antonio, expecting to see hesitation. After all, his initial contract was only for 3 months. Instead, I saw enthusiasm. "The restaurant has already offered me a permanent position," he confessed. "I was waiting for the right moment to tell you." I looked at my mother, worried about her health, about the distance from the doctors who had been monitoring her for years. She shrugged. "The doctors here are great," she said simply. "And I've discovered that the Tuscan air does wonders for my blood pressure." I accepted the grant, trembling inside, but with a growing certainty that I was making the right decision. It wasn't just about academic research. It was about completing a circle, about honoring my grandmother's journey by taking the reverse path, about putting down roots in the same hills from which she had departed. The following months passed in a blur of intensive research, baby preparations, and constant discoveries. Antonio flourished in the restaurant, already subtly introducing elements of Brazilian cuisine into traditional Tuscan dishes. Mom had become a beloved figure in the village, participating in everything from the local church choir to the seasonal olive harvests. And I, with my belly growing bigger every day, delved deeper and deeper into the buried stories of women who crossed oceans. Our son was born on a winter dawn, when the hills were covered by a thin layer of snow, something rare in that region. We decided to name him Pietro, after my Brazilian grandfather I never met, creating another link in that chain that connected 2 continents. The birth took place in the small hospital in the neighboring town, with an elderly midwife, who insisted on whispering ancient Tuscan blessings into the baby's ear as soon as he was born. 3 generations of our family gathered in the same hospital room, in a land that was simultaneously strange and familiar. Mom held her grandson, with silent tears streaming down her time-worn face. Antonio opened a bottle of Vin Santo that he had saved especially for the occasion. And I, exhausted but strangely awake, realized that I had found something I had always sought without knowing. Belonging. Not the belonging that comes from fixed roots in a single place, but the kind of belonging that transcends borders, that is built through shared stories, inherited courage, choices that honor the past while embracing the future. In the months following Pietro's birth, I finalized my research and began writing the book that had become my obsession. It was no longer just an academic work on Italian immigration, but a personal narrative that intertwined the story of my grandmother, my own, and my son's. 3 generations connected by courageous choices, by departures and returns. When Pietro was 6 months old, we received an unexpected visit. Teresa and Vincenzo arrived unannounced, laden with gifts and eager to meet their grandson. Seeing my mother-in-law walk the same streets where I had found my own family history created a sense of completeness that I never thought possible. "So, are you going back to Brazil when the grant ends?" Teresa asked one afternoon, while we watched Pietro playing on the living room rug. I looked out the window, at the centuries-old olive trees that had witnessed so many departures and returns. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I think I've learned that home isn't necessarily a fixed place." She smiled, that wise smile of someone who knows deep truths about life. "That's why I organized that going-away party disguised as a baby shower," she confessed. "Because I knew you needed to be pushed out of the nest. Some people do." We laughed together, accomplices now in a way we had never been before. Deep down, we both knew that going-away party had turned into something very different. Not a farewell to a place, but a farewell to the fearful woman I had been, to the contained life I had built out of fear of the unknown. In the small Italian village, surrounded by centuries-old olive trees and stone houses, I found not only my roots, but a version of myself I didn't know, adaptable, courageous, and open to new horizons. What began as an uncomfortable surprise had transformed into the greatest gift I had ever received: the freedom to choose my own path, not out of fear, but out of love for the journey. And what about the book? It was published simultaneously in Brazil and Italy the following year, with the title Crossings 3 Generations Between Two Worlds. In the dedication, I wrote simply, "For Teresa, who had the courage to turn a baby shower into a going-away party, and in doing so, changed the course of 3 generations." Sometimes, the best experiences in life are truly the ones we don't plan. And sometimes, we need someone to gently push us into the unknown, to discover how far our wings can take us.